That means the next video of this series will be the final one. Possible partitions of Asia and the Pacific. This time, it won't take 2 years. Well, I'm certainly cutting it a bit close here. Whoops. So back in 2019, I started a series talking about possible partitions that could have happened, with the first video focusing on Europe, the next video on the Americas, and the third video on Africa and the Middle East. And now we're finally on the fourth video for the Asia-Pacific region. Let's get into it. One of the most famous partitions of Asia that did happen was the partition of Korea after World War II by the Soviets and the Americans. It would result in the creation of North and South Korea, which of course led to the Korean War, and Korea remains divided to this day. However, this was not the first time a Korean partition between two outside powers was proposed. In 1592, the Japanese under Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded the Great Chosun dynasty of Korea, resulting in a bloody 6-year conflict that not only preserved Korean independence, but halted Japanese expansionism into Asia for almost 3 centuries. During the war, Korea was partially supported by the Ming dynasty in China. Hideyoshi was ambitious, and during the time of negotiations with China, he tried to negotiate Japan on some sort of equal footing with China, even going as far as to propose a marriage alliance. China wasn't really interested, and one of the proposals they ended up turning down was an offer to partition Korea along its provinces between Ming China and Japan. There aren't any official proposal maps, but if it is divided cleanly between the northern and southern provinces of Chosun Korea, then one example of such a partition would look like this. Amusingly, that's not that different from how North and South Korea are divided right now. This would have fascinating effects for future Korean history, though. When the Manchurians take over China within half a century, perhaps instead of merely making Korea a vassal, they'd be able to fully conquer it, making it further integrated into China. Or maybe Japan holds them off and Korea stays within the Japanese sphere of influence. Perhaps the first Sino-Japanese War never even ends up happening, and that has a lot of implications for the expansion of Japan in the future. So it's very interesting to think about. For the next possible partition, there's the giant island, or tiny continent, of Australia. By the 1830s, the British had colonial claims over the entire landmass, but in 1838 it was divided like this. Many people naturally thought there could be more colonial divisions here, since there was so much land for potential settlement. That basically ended up happening, as the modern-day states of Australia were mostly how the colonies ended up turning out right before they were united into the Commonwealth. But before that, there were various proposals. In 1838, the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society had their own idea on how to further divide up Australia. Even more straight lines. They published this map of their ideas, and for some reason, they have an upside-down Iberian Peninsula for scale. That's, a weird choice. But anyway, basically Australia would be divided into 10 colonies, 9 of which were basically boxes. What is interesting is that Victoria and Tasmania, 2 current states of Australia, would still exist, but in complete opposite locations to where they are now. It makes sense why this proposal never went anywhere. Several of these proposed colonies are in areas that even today would still only have tens of thousands of people, and they would be very insignificant to their neighbors. But this would not be the only proposed partition of Australia. So I already made a video about how Western Australia at various times felt different from the rest of Australia, including both hesitating on joining the Commonwealth in the first place, and then voting to outright secede from it in 1933. Go watch that video if you haven't already. So there is, of course, the obvious map of somehow the secession is allowed to happen, and Australia simply gets partitioned cleanly like this. But there was another possibility pre-Federation. Since Western Australia was hesitant to join the Commonwealth in the first place, there was one particular region in Western Australia named Goldfields that had, you guessed it, a lot of gold. But that area was more pro-Commonwealth. The population that lived there were mostly outsiders from further east that arrived after the initial gold rush that gave the region its name. Similar to how Western Australia felt worried about being overshadowed by the larger population and supposed elites from out east, this area felt like their interests would be overshadowed by the larger population from out west in Perth. On January 3rd of 1900, the Manifesto of Eastern Goldfields Reform League of Western Australia, what a mouthful, was published by the local population, demanding their own colony that would be called Auralia, the Latin term for golden. Obviously this never happened, and Western Australia joined the Federation anyway. But there could have been a weird situation where Auralia forms, joins Australia, and then this remaining bit out west would not join Australia and stay its own separate colony. Maybe in some weird twist of fate, they would find themselves not be able to compete with the rest of Australia without the mineral wealth that they previously had, and would end up joining the Commonwealth at a later date anyway. In any case, this would have been a very large and wild partition. For the next set of divisions, let's look at one of the more famous partitions of Asia, the partition of the British Raj into India and Pakistan. The partition that did end up happening theoretically was to avoid fighting between the Hindu and Muslim majority populations and give each of them their own state. However, the division was not clean and there was a large cross-migration crisis that left many dead or further impoverished. Then add up all the wars between India and Pakistan over places like Kashmir or Bangladesh, and you might wonder if there was a better partition in there somewhere, or at least an alternative one. Well, there was a man named Chowdhury Rahmat Ali, I am so sorry I probably butchered that name to death, who was notable for actually coining the name Pakistan. In the 1930s, he began discussions of a partition of the Raj along religious lines, and at one time supported a concept of establishing multiple Muslim states across the subcontinent that would be united in a sort of commonwealth of nations. Of these various maps showing variations of the idea, the border gore is so tremendous that it's very clear why this would not work, and if anything would be even more chaotic. Truth is, every partition would have resulted in a lot of issues, but that doesn't mean there aren't at least some other interesting ones. During the partition, there were several inner partitions, one of them being a division of Bengal. Bengal was an important region that at one point controlled essentially the eastern half of British India, but by the 1940s was basically a slightly larger Bangladesh. In fact, the partition of Bengal during the partition of India established Bangladesh's borders by dividing Bengal and then giving the Muslim portion a small area in Assam. For a short time during this process, there was a group hoping to keep Bengal whole and perhaps give it independence as a third state in the partition. There was especially worry that removing the city of Kolkata from Bengal would significantly weaken the region economically if partitioned. Notably, the Prime Minister of British Bengal, Hussein Suhrawardy, again, so sorry I probably destroyed that name, who wanted a unified Bengal state that would have power sharing between both Hindus and Muslims. At first, the Indian National Congress was open to the idea, but they changed their minds by the time of the partition. There was also a question on Assam, which would either be a part of India and cut off, or given to Bengal, but potentially causing even more tensions to the religious divide. Perhaps there's a compromise where Bengal becomes a third independent state without a total partition, but giving India a tiny bit of territory up north like in our timeline to connect it with Assam. Assuming everything else goes the same way as in our timeline, that would result in a map looking like this. That could be one interesting alternate partition, but of course the one that most people are imagining is about Jammu and Kashmir. The situation was very complicated as Kashmir was pressured to join both sides and effectively forcibly seized and unofficially partitioned by both sides. I just don't see any sort of partition change that wouldn't have still resulted in Pakistan and India fighting over it. There was a time during the Cold War in which a plebiscite over the fate of Kashmir was proposed, and that never happened. But what if Kashmir did have some sort of plebiscite or officialized partition of its own between India and Pakistan? Let's say there's a partition before the Sino-Indian War, and that's along Muslim versus non-Muslim lines. That would roughly look like this. If somehow this is accepted, then this would be the resulting map. Or hey, maybe both that and the Bengal thing happens. Who knows? Obviously, a lot of these partitions lead more towards hypothetical alternate history than we're super close to actually happening, and it's kind of a thing that's true across this entire series. It's partially why it took so long to do, because despite combining two continents together, there just weren't as many actually negotiated partition proposals to choose from. But nevertheless, I'm happy that I was able to finish the series. Well, I mean, I guess there's still Antarctica, but the only partition plans there are the proposed claims that are still there that aren't really enforced. Just like with the previous partition videos in this series, members of my Patreon get exclusive access to full resolution partition maps, as well as several other benefits such as watching videos early. Their continued support helps keep the channel going, and they have my eternal thanks. But here's another fun thing for you viewers. I've made previous videos where you get to vote on different peace plans, the first one being about the peace treaties of World War I, and the second one being about the Congress of Vienna. So for another absurd and even more chaotic situation, the next one is actually going to be about the partition of India. That's right, we're going to make a crazy situation even crazier. The link to the Google survey is below, and within a month there will be a video showing the results. I am frankly terrified of all the border gore that's probably going to happen, but at least it'll be interesting fun. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.